Good morning. I am your everyday average Jonathan. This week we will begin the second half of the Morningstar build where I mount the handle to the shaft and to the chain and put the entire piece together. Also, instead of my usual what I've learned, what the mistakes I made, what I took away from it on each build, this particular one there is a historical exploration and a rabbit hole that I'd like to invite you down with me, and we'll be doing that right at the end. I hope that you join me for that as well. Let's get to the shop and get started. So this area that I live in was damaged in 2012 by what's called the High Park Fire, a very destructive fire for the area. A lot of homes lost, a lot of beautiful terrain lost in our area. But as a result of that, there's a lot of slash piles, a lot of down timber, both for firewood, but also for things like this, where you can go hunting to find all sorts of timber for your different tools. And I take advantage of that constantly, honestly. I'm very fortunate in that regard to have both an amazing view of the mountains that the fire gave us, but at the same time, a little bit of extra material to work with. I chose this piece of timber. It's gnarled. It's got a really interesting, I call it sort of a root culture at the bottom of it. It's what I'll be using for the handle. It needs some shaping, and I'll use my trusty rusty bandsaw for exactly that. I'm going to leave that root culture, it's not a root culture, but I'm just going to call it that. I'm going to leave that in place for this build, but what I need to do is take the handle above that portion and make it as straight as possible for this particular build. My bandsaw got it as close as possible to straight and to the form factor that I want it to be, but now I'm going to use this Ryobi Home Depot belt sander just to make sure that things are level across the entire length and width of this. And as I often say, stay away from 45-degree angles in your designs. They're just commonplace. The eye can pick them out as commonplace. Not that they can't look good, they certainly can. But if you want to do something slightly different, as I'm doing here, use something else. I'm using a 30-degree router bit to chamfer the edges of this particular handle, and now I'm hitting this with 120 grit sandpaper. I'm not going to go any finer than that because I want this to be a little bit rough hewn. And of course, end up with charring the wood, which is what I do on most all of my handles. I want it to close the grains. I want it to be solid. I want it to be structural and tight. I'll hit a little oil at the end here, a little linseed oil to put on and weatherproof this. And when you're going to mount a head, a shovel head, an axe head, a spear head, most of the time what you create out of metal is something called the socket, and oftentimes that's Blacksmith, that's rough hewn directly from the actual metal piece that you're going to use itself. I chose to cheat a little bit here. I was going to use this pipe. Now this pipe is very thick material, so it appealed to me quite a bit, but it's what I'm going to use to make the socket to mount the head of this chain to. Some sockets are fully enclosed as a tube to themselves. I chose to do this in halves, this way that you could see the wood underneath it going all the way up to the top. I kind of like that aesthetic. Even though this isn't a stylized piece, this particular socket, I wanted to give it a little bit of character, so I rounded off those edges to a 30-degree angle, and then I'm putting in this little bit of a hole offset with one another so that it has kind of an interesting look to it. And then I'm going to create a cap. I'm going to create a cap in 3 parts and drop them, of course. But once I put that on there, I'll weld those in place, and that's going to become the top section of this socket before I mount the chain to it. And as is true with pretty much any welding that I do, I'm not very good at welding, so there's often a lot of sanding, a lot of grinding, a lot of polishing that's done. No different here. That's exactly what we're going to do. Get this thing doctored up so that it looks presentable on the end of the flail. I'm going to go ahead and blacken it here in oil, get it hot and soak it in that oil. And now what I'm creating is the last hasp or link, if you will, to the head, the handle of this particular morning star. Something that's going to grab the chain and grab the spiked head and attach it to the handle itself. My intention with this particular implement is to capture the chain, to surround the socket that I just created, and then to set 2 rivets through it, through the wood, onto either side of the socket, through the handle, and fasten it that way. And something that I try not to forget to do, I have from time to time, is add the Blacksmith's touch mark. That's your trademark, that's your icon, that's your logo that you add to your work. And it's something that's actually, I think, kind of important to do so that people can tell if that is an item that was made by somebody, but whether it was made by you and they know who you are, but just in general that it was made by a human being who took the care to put it together and put their mark on it. I think it's important. What I chose to do here was put in some square head lag bolts through this. They're 1/4 inch, they're not super thick, but instead of using nails or using some sort of rivet that I fashioned myself, I was going to use these bolts, heat the heads up, and go ahead and rivet them on. It worked really well. I've done it before. The square head on the other side, all I have to do is hit it with the hammer a few times and it deforms it so that it doesn't look exactly like a square head lag screw. Normally when I'm working in my shop, I don't believe in crying, I don't believe in tears, but every now and then something happens and tears are warranted. And here I fractured the clasp that I was making for that chain. Well, there was some swearing, there was some throwing of things, whatnot, but what I ended up doing is just go ahead and welding that thing back on. And I welded the rivet in place too, as you can see here, and I'm just going to mushroom it over. It's cheating, but at the same time, I'm not going to remake that particular piece of metal from the get-go. I'm just going to use what I have and make it work. And now we are ready to put this thing to the test to try to wield it. Now, as I move this, I want you to notice how unwieldy it is. Notice how off weight it is, out of kilter it is. Moving this, and believe it or not, I've actually swung a few weapons in my day at targets. And this is an extremely difficult weapon to hold, to control, to feel confident in. I will say this, if you're going to use this in any sort of combat, you better hope there's no one around you other than your opponent, because you're going to brain yourself and you're probably going to brain the people around you with it. Still, it's a very fun item to have, very interesting item, but not something I feel confident using whatsoever. There is a really cruel irony that a weapon, something designed to do harm, can have a beauty or an intrigue of its own. I think this has that. This captures that. Well, there you have it. The medieval Morningstar came into existence primarily to combat heavily armored opponents, rather like the medieval Warhammer did. Or did it?
Pretty cool, right? But taking a dive into the history of the Morningstar took me down a rabbit hole that I never thought I would experience. My entire life, I always thought that a Morningstar was a spiked ball with a chain attached to a handle. But it turns out that I was wrong my entire life. So, come with me down this rabbit hole. First of all, this is a Morningstar. Wait, you might say, hold on, that's a mace. Well, I would have said the same thing, and it turns out that we're both wrong. This is actually a Morningstar. It's a Morningstar because of the spiked ball, a la a star in the sky. A mace, it turns out, is very similar in design. It's going to be a handle with a large metal object on top, but unlike the spikes, A mace is going to have flanges on it. It's going to have metal ridges to it. It's not going to have spikes. The mace exists in a similar family, as does the Morningstar, as does an actual warhammer. They're from very similar time periods. They're in the same families. They're meant essentially for the same things, to combat fully armored opponents when swords and axes could break through the armor and just glance off. So then, what is the spiked ball that's on the end of a chain that's on the end of a wooden handle? This is a flail. More specifically, this is a spiked flail or military flail. But it turns out, and this is the incredible thing that I learned doing research, it turns out that this may have never existed at all. Firstly, there are no historical examples that exist today of the spiked flail. There are none. It turns out that the only actual examples of these in history, the oldest examples, are replicas. Replicas of what? They're replicas of something where the original copy doesn't exist. These copies, without originals, that are the oldest known examples of these, they were made in the 18th and 19th centuries, far beyond the time when they would have been used because gunpowder had long been invented, so weapons like these weren't necessary anymore. Also, the examples of these that currently exist, the oldest known examples, were never used. They were never used in combat. They were made as ornamental pieces to show rank and status for royals, sitting on a wall or mounted on a wall in someone's mansion or someone's palace or someone's castle. Still, if we go down the rabbit hole even further, we ask ourselves, are there any illustrations, are there any renderings or paintings done where weapons like this historically would have been depicted? And the answer is yes. Going as far back as the 1300s, there are paintings, there are artist illustrations from the time that show weapons like this. Here's the amazing thing about that. These illustrations are not historical illustrations, meaning they weren't depicting a famous battle in a field or a famous battle between two armies that we knew happened. Instead, they're renderings by artists of the time, which were done in of exotic situations, exotic adventures, fantastical or fantasy drawings. In fact, these drawings had grotesque beasts that never existed, odd characters, and even maybe devils or demons running around with humans fighting them. They were comic books of their time, if you will. Hardly anything to base the historical accuracy of a piece of weaponry or armor on. Those drawings are not that. Still, there are a few illustrations that go pretty far back in time where these might have been depicted. Here's the interesting thing. There are historical drawings of famous battles where off to the side, looped into some warrior's belt, are 3 spiked balls looped in the belt. But they're hard to see. There are no chains that you can see, and there's no handle, just 3 spiked balls, leading the person to say, well, that may have been one of these flails. There are several of those that exist where the actual weapon itself cannot be fully seen, therefore cannot be fully set.
And you're going to have to forgive me here. We were experiencing a pretty significant windstorm outside, and the microphone kept picking up on the noise outside and trying to find the right audio source. So I'm going to put some subtitles to what's coming because the audio is garbage, and I apologize. Now back to our regular programming.
Weapon was being used at that time in that battle, historically depicted by that artist of the time. This mystery has gathered enough steam and enough scholarly and historical power that the preeminent museum in the entire world, in my opinion, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, Met, who owns the best collection, again, in my opinion, of medieval military weaponry and armor in the world, and they actually took their examples of this, of a spiked flail, they took them off display. They took them off display because the experts finally gathered enough momentum to say, what you have on display are not actually medieval weapons. Because they're replicas, and they're known to be replicas, they're known by when they were made, and what time period they're made, that the actual display, which says medieval weaponry, they can't be displayed alongside of other true medieval weapons, true medieval armor. Then that acquiesced. They finally agreed, and they removed those items from display. You can see pictures of those items if you do cursory research on the internet, and they're amazing. They're absolutely outstanding workmanship. And I want to see them if I was in the Met, but in fact, the Met said, these don't qualify as medieval pieces anymore. You can't, in good knowledge, put them on display alongside the other true medieval pieces. And while I don't think that there is any irrefutable evidence that they did not exist, there certainly is no irrefutable evidence that they did exist. So essentially the jury got as to whether or not the spiked flail was an actual item that was used. My thought is probably somewhere at some point in time, something like this, exactly like this, was used. But it wasn't common. It wasn't something that it was a rare occurrence, potentially very rare. Still, of course, as we discover more things, we're seeing the news headlines constantly where a farmer in a field in somewhere in Europe is finding a hoard of things. We might find one. There might be one found, and that would be really cool. But the point is that for my entire life and through much of popular culture, movies, cartoons, comic books, stories, the Morning Star was incorrectly attributed as a name to this item, and it's an item that very possibly never actually existed. I find that endlessly fascinating. I hope you do too. I hope you enjoyed this build. I look forward to sharing my next project with you. Next week, I will be building a few Christmas presents that are going to go out to my family members. So it'll be a combination of a few things that will be a short build, but a very fun build. I hope that you join me then. Until then, be well.